In the heart of Philadelphia stands a place where suffering didn't end with death. Eastern State Penitentiary wasn't just a prison. It was a machine designed to break the human mind. Here, torture wasn't done with chains or blades, but with silence. Prisoners were locked alone for months at a time, denied voices, denied touch, denied light. Many went insane long before their bodies gave out. Official records mention dozens of deaths from violence, exhaustion, and unexplained injuries. Unofficially, the number is far higher. And after the prison closed, the reports became even stranger. Footsteps echoing in empty cell blocks, knocking from sealed doors, and whispers drifting through hallways where sound shouldn't travel at all. In Eastern State, silence is alive, and it still has something to say. Eastern State Penitentiary was built in a place where there was supposed to be nothing but silence, in the quiet Fairmount district of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. In the 1820s, this area was little more than farmland and dirt roads, far from the noise of the city. But the government chose it deliberately. They wanted a facility that would reinvent punishment by breaking the mind, not the body. Architect John Haviland was tasked with creating a structure that would isolate a human being so completely that solitude itself became the punishment. The prison was designed like a stone sunburst, long cell blocks extending from a central tower, where a guard could, in theory, observe every corridor at once. The purpose was simple. The prisoner should feel watched at all times, even when no one was there. The first inmates arrived in 1829, and almost immediately it became clear that the system worked too well. Within weeks, prisoners began whispering to themselves. Some lost their sense of time. Others were found sitting motionless in darkness, staring into corners of their cells as if expecting someone to appear, someone who had never existed. The first official death was recorded in 1833, a man who supposedly died of sudden heart failure. But the attending physician noted his eyes were wide open, frozen in terror, and his body showed signs of severe emotional distress. A year later, 2 inmates killed themselves by repeatedly striking their heads against the stone walls, without screaming, without calling for help. Only the dull thud echoed through the corridor before being swallowed by silence. Administrators called these events isolated incidents. But among the guards, a different belief took root. The building itself was pressing down on the inmates, as if the stone carried memory and returned fear to anyone who stepped inside. This was the beginning of a place that would one day become known as one of the most haunted locations in America, standing in the heart of Philadelphia. The isolation system inside Eastern State was unlike anything the country had seen before. Each cell was a stone coffin, thick walls over 1 meter wide, a wooden door inside, and a heavy iron door outside. Food was delivered through a small slot, the only moment of the day when an inmate heard even the slightest hint of movement. Silence was meant to reform them, but instead, it dismantled them. One of the prison's strictest rules was the ban on seeing other human beings. Whenever an inmate was taken out of his cell, guards placed a rough, light-blocking hood over his head. He couldn't see faces, halls, or even the sky. Inside the darkness of the hood, breath became the only sound, and time dissolved into nothing. Under these conditions, the first psychological fractures appeared. Medical journals from the 1830s describe hundreds of hallucination cases. One inmate insisted someone walked inside his cell at night. The The footsteps were too clear to be imagined, yet guards found nothing. Another claimed he heard whispers inside the walls, so persistent that he tried to tear out the stone with his bare hands, leaving bloody streaks on the floor. The official report labeled it a nervous episode, though the doctor noted the man's fingers were broken in a way suggesting he wasn't clawing stone, but something that resisted. By 1840, some inmates stopped responding to guards' voices entirely. Men sat crouched in corners for hours without blinking. Others repeated the same phrase endlessly, as if echoing someone else's voice rather than their own. Medical logs also document sudden bursts of aggression, prisoners throwing themselves at empty space as if defending against someone unseen. But the most disturbing were the nighttime sounds. Guards increasingly reported knocking coming from locked cells when every prisoner was accounted for. Officials explained it as thermal expansion of stone. Yet those who worked the night shift knew the truth. The knocks had rhythm, deliberate, patterned, like signals, and no one could explain who or what was trying to communicate from inside. By the mid-1840s, Eastern State already had a reputation as a place where isolation worked too well. But it was during this period that the first official reports began to appear. Deaths that did not fit into any logical explanation. Mental breakdowns were no longer rare, and injuries no longer looked accidental. The staff increasingly whispered that the prison wasn't just confining people, it was responding to them. The first major case happened in the winter of 1843. Inmate James Lowry was found dead in his cell, sitting upright as if he had simply fallen asleep. But the physician noted that although there were no signs of struggle, the skin on the inside of his palms was torn. The official report stated, probable attack of madness. Guards claimed that on that same night they heard knocking, slow, rhythmic, and persistent, coming from his block. Less than a year later came the second case. In 1844, young prisoner Samuel Morant was found with a severe skull fracture. The official version claimed he inflicted it himself by repeatedly striking his head against a stone. But the guards who first entered the cell insisted the stone was clean, without blood. The traces instead led to the far corner of the room, empty at first glance. That was when the talk of shadows began. Night shift guards described seeing dark figures at the intersections of corridors, figures that dissolved the moment a lantern's light approached. One guard reported seeing a person standing inside a locked cell, even though all inmates were accounted for. When he stepped closer, the figure seemed to retreat, straight into the wall. The administration dismissed it all as optical illusions caused by stress. Yet several staff members resigned after such nights without giving detailed reasons. By the end of the decade, death and strange occurrences had become part of Eastern State's internal history. Prisoners descended into madness, guards feared night patrols, and the prison itself remained completely indifferent, as if the boundary between reality and something else was beginning to fracture within its walls. By the late 1850s, no one in the prison denied it anymore. The nights had become more dangerous than the inmates themselves. Although official reports continued to blame everything on psychological pressure and isolation, everyone, guards and doctors alike, felt that Eastern State was behaving as if it had a will of its own. The first to sense it were the night shift guards. The corridors of former cell block number 4 had begun to change, not physically, but an atmosphere. Lanterns flickered dimly, as if reacting not to drafts, but to movement. Several guards wrote in their reports that they sometimes saw a shadow standing a few meters ahead of them, only for it to vanish the moment they took a step forward. Most unsettling was how similarly they described it. Tall, thin, motionless, with no facial features at all. In 1857, one of the guards, Mark James Grayson, disappeared during his shift. His lantern was found lying in the middle of the corridor, its beam pointing directly at the door of cell 41. The cell was empty. It hadn't housed a prisoner for many years. Grayson was searched for 3 days. The yards, the ventilation shafts, even the underground drains, nothing. The official report stated probable escape, but no one believed in an escape that left no tracks, no noise, and no chance. After that, several guards began refusing to work night shifts. One, before resigning, wrote in his final report, "Someone walks here at night, and it's not the living." At the same time, prisoner complaints increased. Some said they heard whispering inside the walls, footsteps outside their locked cells, or the feeling of being watched, even when the corridors were empty and completely silent. Psychologists dismissed it as isolation-induced hallucinations. But the strangest part was that the prisoners who reported these things had never met each other, yet they repeated the same details. By then, Eastern State was no longer just a prison. It had become a place where the darkness didn't hide events, it participated in them. By the early 1860s, the first official reports of psychological breakdowns among the staff of Eastern State began to appear. Previously, such incidents occurred mostly among prisoners, but now the ones who started breaking were the very people meant to maintain order. Employees working night shifts began quitting so frequently that the administration was forced to increase pay for overnight patrols. The reason always sounded the same: an unbearable sense of presence. In 1861, Guard Archibald Royce became the first to formally request a transfer after several nights of hearing footsteps behind him in the corridor. He was a seasoned officer, a former soldier, not prone to panic or hallucinations. But every time he returned from his patrol, his face was pale as chalk. In his report, he wrote, "The footsteps don't match mine. They're shorter, faster, and they don't fall behind." 2 weeks later, he quit. Not long after, an incident occurred that later became known as the first unreal sighting. One guard, Thomas Eldridge, reported seeing a figure in cell 6, and not just one. He claimed 3 men stood inside, their shapes dark and indistinct, all facing his direction, as if waiting. But when he returned with another officer and opened the door, the cell was empty and cold, though the corridor air was warm. Eldridge was dismissed for inability to perform duties. But a month later, another guard, young Henry Sloan, described the exact same thing. He also saw 3 dark figures inside cell 6. He didn't even approach. The shapes simply vanished like smoke the moment he blinked. That was when the administration issued, for the first time in the prison's history, a rule forbidding staff to work alone in that wing. But the most unsettling part was this: those who saw the 3 from cell 6 used identical wording. They described them as people without faces, just standing still, waiting. At that time, Eastern State still tried to present itself as a model prison. But those who worked inside knew the truth. The prison had stopped watching. It had started responding. By the late 1860s, Eastern states' walls had absorbed so much silence, suffering, and whispered desperation that even routine inspections became unpredictable. Guards reported that certain corridors behaved differently, as if the architecture itself shifted in response to whoever walked them. What had once been a perfectly symmetrical penitentiary now felt like a maze that rearranged its mood night by night. One of the earliest documented anomalies occurred in the northern block, where temperatures began dropping inexplicably. Inspectors recorded a difference of 16 degrees between two adjacent cells, something physically impossible with the building's construction. Prisoners complained of freezing drafts despite sealed stone walls. Some claimed they woke up unable to move, feeling a pressure on the chest, like a knee or a hand. But the most disturbing phenomenon emerged in 1867. It started with faint knocking. At first, it was rhythmic, almost like someone tapping on metal pipes. But the sound didn't travel through walls. It followed specific guards. One officer, Samuel Griggs, heard the knocking behind him every night of his shift, always at the exact pace of his steps. He tried stopping suddenly. The knocking stopped too. When he ran, it sped up. When he finally turned around during one patrol, he found the corridor empty. But the knocking continued, now coming from both sides of him at once. Within a week, Griggs requested reassignment. He never returned. Around the same time, prisoners began reporting identical nightmares, visions of a tall, thin figure standing at the foot of their beds. The dream was always described the same way. It did not move. It only stared. What unified these accounts was the chilling detail that the figure seemed too tall to be human. Administration dismissed the reports as hysteria, until one morning a guard found scratch marks on the inside of 4 different cell doors. All 4 prisoners swore they never touched the walls that night. Their fingernails were intact. Experts who examined the scratches noted something unusual. The marks were too high, almost reaching the ceiling. That was the moment staff began admitting, quietly and only to each other, what they feared most. Whatever walked Eastern State at night was no longer interested in the prisoners. It was interested in them. By the early 20th century, the prison had long ceased to be just a place for holding criminals. Eastern State Penitentiary had become a structure where silence felt alive and darkness seemed to have its own intentions. Guards rotated constantly. No one lasted long here. Some blamed exhaustion and night shifts. Others felt something they refused to speak about aloud. The first serious troubling reports appeared in the early 1900s. Several guards claimed they heard quiet voices in the corridors of Cell Block 4, so close they could feel warm breath on their skin. They turned around and saw an empty passageway. No inmates, no footsteps, just stone walls that seemed to listen to their fear. In 1903, guard William Reed disappeared during a night patrol. His notebook was found on the floor, open. On the page, there was only one word: behind. His body was never recovered. After this incident, maintenance workers began noticing that certain corridors were deteriorating unnaturally fast. Plaster peeled away in long vertical streaks, as if someone with tall, thin fingers ran them across the wall. One engineer even stated that the cracks formed patterns, too symmetrical to be accidental. But the most terrifying accounts came from the inmates themselves. They saw a figure in cell doorways, thin, unnaturally tall. Its silhouette was always distorted, with proportions no human body could match. Some prisoners refused to sleep, sitting in corners until delirium and exhaustion broke their sanity. Medical reports from those years repeated the same descriptions: dilated pupils, panic, terrified to look toward the door. By the time the prison closed in 1971, every staff member knew the unspoken rule. Everyone would eventually experience something that defied reality. Everyone heard footsteps behind them. Everyone felt eyes watching from empty cells. Everyone saw movement where no living person stood. Today, Eastern State is a museum. Tourists photograph the abandoned cells, listen to audio guides, laugh. But those who work there every day say the same thing. The prison was never empty. Some inmates simply stopped being visible.